I came out of the doctors, and there was a representative of Purdue. She said, we have a drug called OxyContin. We pick up all the costs. Just take as much as you need. I said, sounds like a deal.
Within the last 20 years, more than 500,000 Americans have been killed by overdoses. Controlled-release OxyContin would be the drug that triggered the opioid crisis. But what if we discovered that the crisis started with a crime?
When we talk about drugs like oxycodone, you're talking about drugs that are essentially heroin pills. Opioid makers started to promote their opioids for common chronic pain conditions.
Purdue didn't have any evidence that the drug was safe, so the company obtained the help of a medical officer at FDA.
This is the first time I've ever seen this. This isn't just unethical. I think this could be illegal.
Hundreds and hundreds of sales reps go out and meet with doctors and say, the FDA approved this.
Big Pharma celebrated its marketing muscle, using parties to lure doctors to write scripts.
This was a new drug cartel. There were drug dealers wearing suits and lab coats.
Basically, here's some money, write some scripts.
Yes, I'm looking at this and I'm going, clearly we're breaking the law.
Purdue ends up getting pursued by the authorities. The company lied under oath.
Ethics did not play a role. The companies took out their checkbooks and paid to keep the evidence hidden.
You are basically telling pharmaceutical companies you have a green light to do this.
It explains how America got hooked on opioids.
Doctors willing to be paid to prescribe the drug, those are the people that are going to get you promoted and eventually put you in prison.
The abuse exploded and spread like cancer.
When you're in that much pain and you're addicted to such a high dose, you're a trap rat.
When the companies didn't like that they were being held accountable, they decided to change the statute.
They should be changing their behaviors, not the rules.
People were dying by the tens of thousands, and their own representatives are basically selling them down the river.
If you talk to people whose lives have been touched, what does matter to a lot of these people is truth.
She was on fentanyl, she was on amitriptyline, she was on a hypnotic for sleep. She would take the medication, and then she would get confused, she would get loopy, and then, you know, a half hour, 45 minutes later, she would think, oh, I've got to take my medication.
You can make a lot of money getting doctors to prescribe a medication to people who don't need it.
OxyContin was what they stressed they wanted sales out of.
Hundreds and hundreds of sales reps go out and meet with doctors.
The doctor, he's a businessman. I gotta show him the WIFM. What's in it for me?
We were constantly being told you needed to get over your opioid phobia, no dose is too high, and your patient can't get addicted.
A representative of Purdue said, you just take as much as you need.
Once you got them hooked, you were going to get reoccurring prescriptions.
It would almost take me 15 minutes just to eat them all, 25 twice a day. You know, it was like sitting down to a bowl of Cheerios.
Did I really care about being responsible? No.
People were dying by the tens of thousands.
Look, doctor, stop with the BS. This is what it's about. It's about you prescribing this medication and me paying you as a direct result. Are you in or you're out?
Good afternoon and welcome to Washington Post Live. I'm Frances Steed Sellers, a senior writer at the Washington Post. Today we're going to be discussing a new two-part documentary set to premiere next week. It's about the opioid crisis in the United States, and it's called The Crime of the Century. I'm delighted to welcome director Alex Gibney and two of my Washington Post colleagues, Sari Horowitz and Scott Hyam, both investigative journalists whose reporting was key to the narrative. A very warm welcome to you all.
Thanks. Great to be here.
Thank you.
Alex, let's start with you. You've done films on topics as varied as Scientology, election interference, and the coronavirus. What drew you to this particular topic, and how long have you been working on it?
I've been working on it for about 3 years, and honestly, what drew me to the topic was a conversation with the investigative unit at the Post, the editors there. I believe even at that first lunch, Scott Hyam was there, and they brought it to my attention that we had been kind of misunderstanding the opioid crisis as a kind of a natural catastrophe like a hurricane or a flood, and that it really involved a series of crimes and also a series of chapters related to the kinds of drugs. And so with that in mind, it seemed like a huge story that was just kind of hiding in plain sight. And so I was determined to dig in, to tell a story about the forest rather than the trees.
Wow. And Scott, so you were there at this original lunch. Tell us about your early recognition. I mean, Alex just used the term crime. What was your realization? What was going on at the beginning of that collaboration that's so key to this movie?
Well, like any great investigation, this one began with a simple question and a curious reporter. The question was, why are there so many pills on the streets of America? And why are so many people overdosing? What is going on here? And that question was asked of Lenny Bernstein, who's a reporter on the health desk. And Lenny began reporting like any good reporter would do, and start by calling sources, developing sources, looking at court documents, looking at settlement documents between drug companies and the DEA and the Justice Department, trying to figure out what was going on here. And in the course of his reporting, he came across a guy who you'll see in the documentary, a guy named Joe Ranazizi, who was the head of the DEA's Diversion Control Division, which oversees the pharmaceutical industry. And Joe was kind of the ultimate insider who was pushed out of the agency, and we'll talk about him a little bit later. But Lenny and I worked on this investigation for 2 years. We did a collaboration with 60 Minutes that some of you may have seen. And then Sari joined the investigation almost 4 years ago at a very critical point when we were about to get a bunch of documents that really blew this story wide open. And Sari's going to talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, sorry, I'm curious about that. So you came in a little bit later. Fentanyl was the drug of choice, I think, at that moment, or coming in. Tell us about what drew you in at that point and what was going on, just the big picture as briefly as you can.
Well, Francis, 4 years ago, I was covering the Justice Department, and officials there kept talking to me about this street drug called fentanyl that was killing thousands of people. It was a synthetic opioid made in China, sold over the internet, and people were buying this. It was being shipped into this country through the mail. It was coming in through the Postal Service and also over the Southwest border. And they told me it was the deadliest drug on the street at that time. And so I had a lot of questions. It was kind of, where did this come from? How did this start? Where did it start? Why was it killing so many people? Why was it so popular? And why was law enforcement having such a hard time stopping it? And so I went and talked to my old friend, Scott Hyam. We had worked together a lot before. And I asked him about this because he was covering the prescription opioid epidemic. And we compared notes and quickly realized that these two epidemics, fentanyl and prescription pills, were connected. And in fact, the fentanyl epidemic was the third wave of what started with prescription pills. Prescription pills were on the street. They were legal. They were highly addictive. Government cracked down on them. People who addicted to them turned to heroin. And then the Chinese drug dealers exploited that market by selling, exporting fentanyl, which was cheaper and more potent. And so Scott and I started to do some stories about fentanyl. And we started just the two of us. And we're going to talk about this more later, but this expanded into a massive investigation involving like 60 people in the newsroom, led by Jeff Lean and Dave Fallis, and it became the Opioid Files.
Right. So this was this huge investigation. But Alex, let's take a step back, because you come into the Post, you see this investigation in its burgeoning form, but you need to tell a documentary. Tell us about part one, about the history of this crisis that you dig into in this fascinating two-part movie.
Yeah, a lot of what the Post did was to focus on the second and third waves, but also the role of these big pharmaceutical distributors. But strictly speaking, the opioid crisis starts with the story of Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family. And so part one really focuses on that. That's kind of the match that lights the forest fire that engulfs the country. And so we spent a good time dealing with that. Indeed, we went further back than that. We went as far back as King Tut. I mean, the remarkable thing is that the Purdue Pharma company convinced people, after hundreds of years of experience of understanding just how addictive is opium or opiates, going back to the Opium War with China, going way back further than that. That suddenly they convince people that, oh no, opiates really aren't addictive, and you can take as much as you want. And the most important thing is to redefine pain. So it was that kind of false advertising which set in motion the crisis. And so the first part one of the crime of the century is that tale up to about 2006, 2007, when a number of very assiduous and aggressive prosecutors from Western Virginia try to hold the company to account and run afoul of their politically motivated bosses in Washington and have to cut a deal, which ends up sealing a lot of the evidence that would have exposed the crime and allowing hundreds of thousands more to die.
You know, there's a term, Alex, in this first part that jumped out to me so many times: pseudo addiction. What was all that about? I mean, one's addicted or not, but what was pseudo addiction?
The idea was to create a notion that there really was no such thing as addiction, that it was pseudo addiction, that really what people were responding to was that they weren't getting enough relief from the pain. So in order to cure pseudo addiction, the response then was to titrate up, to up the dose. What a magical formula for a company that happens to be pushing opioids. You know, if there's a problem with addiction, no worries, we're just going to increase the dosage. It was madness, but it was something that was briefly accepted as gospel, and yet it was part of a larger marketing mechanism that was really at play here.
So this was all about marketing more broadly, getting these drugs to be available to not just people with severe pain, but more broadly than that.
Yeah, I think, look, let's be honest and say that if you have a serious operation, opioids can be a hugely valuable drug for a few days afterwards. You know, I remember after a knee operation getting morphine. It was great. It's hugely effective in terms of stilling pain. And long release oxycodone, which is OxyContin, that the contin is the long release mechanism that Purdue formulated for cancer patients at the end of life suffering excruciating pain. These pills can be very valuable. But the business strategy for Purdue was to say, oh, let's expand the market, because it's not going to be a very profitable drug just to have this very narrow market. We want a much bigger market, and the bigger market would be anybody in any kind of chronic pain at all. So if you're an 18-year-old and you have a knee injury, how about OxyContin? The problem was that once people started using OxyContin, they began to be addicted. And also, because there was so much potent drug in this time-release formula, also a lot of people who were seeking a vigorous high learned how to break down the time-release formula and really get a massive amount of opioid in their system by snorting it or injecting it. And Purdue knew all these problems, but they swept them under the rug in the service of a marketing plan that was really designed to achieve greater profits. I mean, the drug ended up outselling Viagra. And the problem was that there was this terrible collateral damage, and the collateral damage was death.
Wow. So we'd like to show a short clip from part 2 of the documentary now.
Other drug companies moved into that market that Purdue had created. They moved into that huge opioid multi-billion-dollar market.
So other manufacturers began making generic versions of OxyContin, oxycodone, hydrocodone. Drug distributors started sending massive amounts of these drugs downstream because they were corrupt doctors all over the country. It became like the Wild West. This was a new drug cartel that was being established in the United States, but instead of coming in from a foreign country, there were drug dealers who were wearing suits and lab coats.
So, Sari, what kind of tools did you use to start uncovering the breadth and scale of this disaster?
So, as Scott and I start to do our investigation, at the same time, there was a massive lawsuit being filed in Cleveland, in Ohio. And this speaks to Alex's point about the collateral damage. Thousands of cities, towns, counties, Native American tribes were suing the major players in the opioid drug industry for the collateral damage, for what had happened to their communities. And as part of this lawsuit, they were given access, the parties involved in this lawsuit were given access to a confidential DEA government database that is called ARCOS. And it tracked every prescription pain pill from the manufacturer to the distributor to the pharmacy. So it showed where all these pills were going. And of course, we wanted that database. And we had tried to get it, but had been unfortunately unable to get it. And we thought it would be a blueprint for us in our reporting that database would show kind of unprecedented insight into what the companies knew about which pills, how many pills were going into which community. And so the Washington Post decided to sue to get that lawsuit because it was the parties involved in the lawsuit had it, but it wasn't made public, and they didn't want to make it public. The problem was we couldn't get a law firm in Washington, a major law firm, to represent us because they were all representing the drug industry. And so we got a sole practitioner in Akron, Ohio, to represent us. We lost at the trial court. We appealed to the Sixth Circuit. We won there. And not only did we win the release of this database, but we won the release. We also had asked for in the lawsuit all the documents being exchanged by the parties. And we were thinking there could be potentially some explosive document, internal emails, depositions, reports that would be in this lawsuit. So in July of 2019, this database and all these documents are released to the public. And the Washington Post, let me just say that Marty Barron and Cameron Barr, our two leaders of the newsroom at that point, realized the significance of this story. And they dedicated huge resources and people from all over the newsroom, editors, reporters, photographers, video journalists. And they actually bought on an emergency basis a new computer to handle what was 380 million transactions from this database. And we had this database team under investigative. It was led by incredibly talented Stephen Rich. And he just crashed on this day and night and analyzed this data. And we were able to report from the database that between 2006 and 2014, the drug companies, the opioid companies, saturated this country with 100 billion pain pills. And that's more than one pain pill per person per day in many of these communities. So that was one piece of the database. Then we had all these documents that we had to go through. And people came over from the health team, Lenny Bernstein, who Scott mentioned, and Joel Achenbach. And Jeff Lean was running this whole operation. And we had this video journalist, Dalton Bennett, go out to the communities that we could tell from the database where the pills were going. Very important roadmap. And so he would go to the hardest hit communities and he and his team would interview people there about the tremendous death and destruction that these pills wrought. And a lot of his work is actually in Alex's documentary.
Right. So Scott, take me along. So we've got this big picture, this lawsuit giving you all the details of 100 billion pills going around the country. But you had a particular character, and you mentioned him earlier on, Joe Ranazizi, who was key to understanding how the DEA was disarmed in handling this. Can you tell me about him and the role he played in developing this narrative?
Yes. So Joe is a lifelong DEA agent. So he used to, do meth houses and big cocaine trafficking. organizations, Mexican drug cartels. And then he was promoted to headquarters in Washington, D.C. to run the drug diversion division, which oversees the pharmaceutical industry. And he very quickly realized that he was dealing with a new drug operation that he had never seen, one that was being fueled by corrupt doctors all across the country who were writing prescriptions for cash, writing scripts in exchange for sex. And then he was also seeing that there was a huge amount of pills that were being manufactured, not just by Purdue Pharma, but by all these other companies that most Americans had never heard of. In fact, there's a company called Mallinckrodt, which manufactured the vast majority of oxycodone pills in America. And then in the middle of the drug manufacturers and the pharmacies are the drug distributors. And he saw that these drug distributors were sending millions and millions of pills downstream into these communities, into these pharmacies. And so he put them on notice in 2006 and 2007 and said that they were required under the law to report these things and to hold some of these shipments back if they deemed them to be suspicious. And the DEA had fined some of these companies, and yet the pills kept flowing. First, they were flowing to internet pharmacies, then they were flowing to pill mills in South Florida, and they were just spreading like a blob, it was like a monster movie of these drugs just moving across the country. And more people were dying, more and more people were overdosing, more and more people were getting addicted. And Joe launched this thing called the Distributor Initiative, and he felt like if he could choke off the supply there, that maybe he could start to save some of these communities. Well, what he didn't realize, I don't think, is that he was going up against some of the most powerful forces in America, in corporate America. And these companies fought back with everything that they had. They hired crisis communications firms, they hired lobbyists, they started funneling huge amounts of money into members of Congress to try to derail the DEA's enforcement efforts. And they were successful. They got the law changed. That it was a law that the DEA was using to crack down on these companies, and they got the law changed and basically undermined the DEA at the height of the opioid epidemic. And they got Joe removed from his position at the DEA, and a whole new team was put in place that was much more pro-business and pro-industry. And Joe and his entire team were eviscerated. So Lainey and I worked on those stories for a couple of years, along with Jeff Lean and Dave Fallis as our editors. And then we also did a collaboration with 60 Minutes, and we did 3 or 4 pieces with them, based part on what Joe was telling us. But then we branched out and we found other DEA agents and other investigators who were running into similar problems, and they were establishing big cases against these companies, and they were being shut down at the highest levels of the government. So it was an incredible journey. And then when Sari and I, saw all these documents that we got from the lawsuit, we were kind of blown away by just the depth and breadth of the knowledge that these companies had of the epidemic, and what they did with that knowledge or what they didn't do with that knowledge.
I just want to come back to one sentence you said. You said a couple of times they got the law changed. People just bought in on both sides of the aisle, bought into changing this law that would so disarm the DEA?
Yeah, I mean, with a few changes of wording in a statute, they basically changed what the DEA could do. Previous to this law, the DEA could immediately shut down a company's drug distribution operations if they believed that they were sending drugs downstream when they shouldn't have been. Without a hearing, they could do it immediately because there was an imminent danger to the community. That language was changed, so the DEA had a much higher burden. They have to show that it's an immediate threat to a community, and in most cases, they can't meet that burden. So that was one thing that was stripped away from them. And then the drug industry also got written into the law that if they got caught doing something wrong, they were given a second chance, and they could file a corrective action plan before the DEA could take any action against them. So it's like going into a bank. The DEA's chief judge made this analogy. It's like a bank robber going into a bank, stealing the money, coming out, getting caught, and then saying, "Oh, okay, I'll just put the money back." and no harm,
Wow.
no foul.
Wow.
And so it was a massive change in the law, and a lot of members of Congress, I don't think, really read this bill. In fact, we know that they had publicly stated that they didn't realize what they were signing on to, but that is now the law of the land.
Alex, Joe is a very key player in your documentaries, you tell it, but there are a number of other people. Can you tell us about the process of finding these characters who bring to light the tragedy? I'm thinking of a husband who loses his wife, the efforts you have a local doctor who is recognizing the problem and trying to struggle with it, a dancer, other people who are so deeply embroiled in this, and I'd love to know more about the storytelling process in the film.
Well, long ago, I made a film called Enron, the Smartest Guys in the Room, and the reporter, the key reporter in that story was a woman named Bethany McLean, and she and I always used to say, it's not about the numbers, it's about the people. You know, and in this case, the same thing is true. In order to be able to tell this story, you have to tell the human story. And so we went out on the road to try to find people who could carry the burden of this story. We found a number of what I would call detectives, in addition to Scott and Sari and Lenny, who were all in the film. You know, there were some people who were on this story early on. A New York Times reporter named Barry Meyer, Patrick Radden-Keefe from the New Yorker, but also, you know, there was a character that actually the Washington Post discovered, a kind of Walter White-like character named Caleb Lanier, a guy who had a terrible back issue, you know, was in an awful accident, started taking OxyContin. At some point, you know, his tolerance went up. He couldn't afford it anymore. He turned to heroin. Then he realized, oh my gosh, you know, what about fentanyl? It's so much cheaper. Not only that, I can import it from China and then I can deal it and cover my costs now that I'm addicted to opioids, but also make money. And so you could see the whole cycle in one character. There was a country doctor, as you described, as somebody who tried to lead a crusade against Purdue. During the fentanyl crisis, there was a company called INSYS that was rapaciously trying to sell fentanyl legally, which of course you can do, but they were trying to do it in a very corrupt way by flipping doctors, literally bribing them. They had a return on investment. So if you paid a doctor $10,000 for a so-called speakers program, they would insist that you have you know, that you would write at least $20,000 in prescriptions, which is, of course, the very definition of a bribe. But the person we got to describe that was a key salesperson at INSYS, this company that was doing this, a guy named Alec Burlikoff, who's a character right out of Glengarry Glen Ross. You know, who would tell us with great brio and enthusiasm how he completely corrupted the system. He had a color coding system for doctors in terms of just how corrupt they would be. So through the people, both victims and perps, we were able to tell a story that that I think people can see in very human terms.
And some of them have ended up behind bars, right?
Indeed. Alec Burlikoff is one of those people. Sunrise Lee, an exotic dancer, who became head of sales for a third of the country, for INSYS, is also behind bars. Caleb Lanier is in prison in Texas. So, yeah, a number of these people are behind bars. Of course, those are the people who usually end up behind bars. It's rare. I mean, in the case of INSYS, actually, you have the CEOs behind bars. That's extremely rare. In the case of Purdue and other companies, you know, there was a plan, as I mentioned, for the Department of Justice to charge the three key executives at Purdue with multiple felonies. That would have sent a powerful message to the industry. But as so often happens, when you have a powerful corporation, they lean in with powerful advocates, people like Mary Jo White and Rudolph Giuliani, who really brought a lot of pressure to bear on the Department of Justice. Department of Justice backed down, and they agreed to cut a deal. And the key feature of that deal, while it seemed like a lot of money was being paid in fines, the key feature of the deal was to bury the evidence that had been collected by prosecutors, which would have given so many people an understanding of how these crimes were working. And that, I think, is a really important lesson from this whole story. Over and over and over again, a lot of lawsuits, the lawsuits that Scott and Sari mentioned, there's a scene in the film where we show companies settling. But when the companies settle, and they pay a big fine, almost always they bury the evidence. And so what's really needed and what's so important about what Scott and Sari did and this whole enterprise that we've tried to put together is getting at the truth. Because at the end of the day, that's what prevents these crimes from happening again.
Wow. Sari and Scott, one of you should take this on. You've both mentioned to me how you created this huge database, but it's open. Talk to me about how that's important, and we can only do this briefly, but telling the story in local communities around the rest of the country.
So we made a decision. Is it okay, Sari? So we made a decision very early on to take down our paywall and allow the public to get access to this information that we fought so hard to get and spent a lot of money in lawsuits to free up this information. So everybody out there, if you want to see which manufacturer, which drug distributor, and which pharmacy dispensed opioids in your community, you can go online to the Washington Post and put in opioid files, and you can put in your county, and you can see in that granular detail how many pills were shipped to your community. And we also made public all the internal emails, memorandums, documents, all kinds of this. There's millions of records now that are available because of the lawsuit that was filed by the Washington Post, along with the Charleston Gazette Mail in West Virginia. That was a joint lawsuit. And so we really felt that it was very important, A, to make this available to the general public, but B, to make it available for free, because there's a lot of people out there who are reeling from this epidemic, who can't afford to pay for a subscription to the Washington Post, and we wanted to make sure that everybody had an opportunity to see exactly what happened here. That database and those documents are a blueprint to this epidemic, and it's quite shocking to take a look at it.
And I would just add to that, Francis. I would just add to that one last thing, which is the opioid epidemic continues. It got worse under COVID. It continues, and the lawsuits continue. The very first trial that's been held it just started this week in West Virginia. Just opened. And so the lawsuits continue, the epidemic continues, and like I said, it got much worse under COVID.
Wow, and that brings me to my last question. I'm afraid it has to be a quick one, Alex, for you. Of course, I watched this incredibly distressing movie through the lens of the pandemic. What do those two disasters have in common, both costing hundreds of thousands of American lives? What do they tell us about our public health system?
I think they tell us that our public health system is in need of a major overhaul. Both these crises show that we've got to rebuild it, because the incentives are all wrong. The incentives are profit-oriented incentives, and there's nothing in the Hippocratic Oath that I recall that has to do with supply and demand or market share. It has to do with do no harm and figure out how to serve the patient, not the customer or the client. And so I think we have to overhaul our healthcare system in order to get ourselves back on the right track.
Well, all three of you, thank you so much. Alex Gibney, Sari Horowitz, Scott Hyam, thank you very much for joining me this afternoon.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, Francis.
Thank you, Francis.
Yes, thanks, Francis.
A reminder that the new documentary will air next week, starting on Monday in the evening, an HBO documentary, The Crime of the Century, premiering next week, so be sure to tune in.
Hello, this is Dan Snyder of the Netflix docuseries, The Pharmacist, and I am the pharmacist. It's been shown to 100 million people worldwide and will soon be a movie. Please, tonight, go to HBO, 8 o'clock Central Standard Time. There's a show called The Crime of the Century, and it's about Purdue Pharma and its involvement in initiating the opioid epidemic that is killing so many people today. Please watch this show. It's an ongoing battle. It got started, and it's grown and grown and grown. And the pharmacist is trying to do something about it. So please go to my website, tunnelofhope.org, and be a part of the light at the end of the tunnel and help us combat this opioid and addiction pandemic. Please stay tuned. And also you can go to Facebook, supporters of The Pharmacist, Dan Snyder. Thanks again.
Back now with the first look at the crime of the century, a new documentary from HBO on the opioid crisis in America. With new interviews and leaked documents, the film makes the case that the crisis started with a crime. Ariel Reshef has all the details. Good morning, Ariel.
Good morning to you, George. This documentary explores the highly addictive drug OxyContin and when big pharma companies knew about that addiction and how. And also, it takes a look at much deeper into this crisis.
In his latest documentary, Emmy and Academy Award winning director Alex Gibney is digging into the origins of the country's deadly opioid epidemic.
This is the first time I've ever seen this. This isn't just unethical. I think this could be illegal.
Gibney partnering with The Washington Post for the two-part HBO series, Crime of the Century.
It was a trial from Purdue. They started me with maybe 8 or 10 twice a day. 160s, the highest dose. And that wasn't working, so then he just kept on raising it. I mean, you're a trap rat.
The team spending 3 years unraveling the role of big drug companies like Purdue Pharma and other entities in the catastrophic rise of highly addictive opioids like OxyContin.
For a long time, we've talked about the opioid crisis as if it's a natural disaster like a flood or a hurricane. I became convinced that it was more of a crime, something that had been manufactured. In its own way, it's kind of a murder mystery.
The series exposing explosive legal documents alleging the Sackler family that owns the now bankrupt Purdue Pharma knowingly misled the public about the dangers of OxyContin.
The fraud was pretending that the drug was safe when they knew it wasn't, pretending it wasn't prone to abuse when they knew it was.
The documentary detailing how the drugs made their way into the mainstream, penetrating communities nationwide, the opioid epidemic claiming nearly 500,000 lives in the U.S.
It would be satisfying in some ways to say, oh, it's all the Sacklers and Purdue Pharma. They ignited the opioid crisis. But it's also fair to say that there are a number of other culprits, many other corporations who jumped into the market after Purdue. The Department of Justice that failed to hold these executives at Purdue to account when they had the opportunity in 2007. Our Congress, who literally passed laws by unanimous consent that basically put handcuffs on the DEA. There's a lot of blame to go around. Obviously, there were some dirty doctors as well.
And Purdue Pharma faces up to 3,000 lawsuits. The Sackler family has denied any wrongdoing.
A whole generation of doctors bought into this idea that it's okay to use opioids liberally as long as you're giving them to a patient in pain. That somehow there's a magic halo effect with that prescription pad and your patient won't get addicted.
I came out of the doctors, and there was a representative of Purdue. She said, we have a drug called OxyContin. We pick up all the costs. Just take as much as you need. I said, sounds like a deal.
Within the last 20 years, more than 500,000 Americans have been killed by overdoses. Controlled-release OxyContin would be the drug that triggered the opioid crisis. But what if we discovered that the crisis started with a crime?
Guys, if you need something to watch over the weekend, we do have a Documentary of the Month Club, and this pick it's got a lot of weight to it. It's an important topic. It's called The Crime of the Century. It's on HBO and HBO Max.
Yeah, the two-part film takes an in-depth look at the opioid epidemic and one of obviously the most devastating public health crises of our time.
Yeah, it's a difficult topic, but it really is getting incredible reviews, tons of buzz.
Yeah, Emmy and Oscar-winning director Alex Gibney will join us a week from today to discuss the documentary. So we're going to watch this weekend.
Yep.
Watch with us.